This program is brought to you by Emory University.
So thank you, everybody, for coming. Special thanks to Ben, to Rosemarie, to Laura, and to Jennifer for all of the work that goes into putting these things on. I run a series at which Rosemarie has spoke. It's a lot of work, and you're trying to do your normal job and do all of this other stuff. So I am genuinely appreciative of everyone's efforts and also of your time. So as you heard from Ben, I've been working on the concept of neurodiversity for 15 years, maybe actually a little bit longer. And one of the things that I've noticed is that as it's gained ground, paradoxically, it's become something of a liberal platitude. And it's actually allowed a lot of prejudice and discrimination to sort of go underground, where we nod, yeah, there ought to be room, we ought to make room for autistics. But what does neurodiversity really mean? So I've devoted myself over at least the last 5, maybe 6, 7 years to trying to think about neurodiversity as an actually different brain engaged with culture in a kind of neurocultural way, and to see what would come of really thinking about autistics as having different kinds of brains, but not in a pathological way. And today you're going to hear me talk about a number of things in autism, including a purported preference for objects over people, and thinking about that in a literary context of personification. And so we'll do some neuroscience, some disability studies, and a lot of autistic writing by autistic people. So let me just start. Anyone who knows anything about autism knows about the claim of impaired theory of mind. Simon Baron-Cohen, who has done much to extend the research on Tom, says of autistics that they are unable, quote, to develop an awareness of what is in the mind of another human, end quote. From this claim has come a claim about a profound lack of empathy in autism. If the mental states of others are beyond the reach of autistics, then how can they possibly empathize with someone in pain? So pervasive is this understanding that texts of all kinds have reproduced it unquestioningly. For example, Mark Haddon's best-selling novel, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, presents a protagonist who explicitly states that he lacks theory of mind and who cares little for others, or perhaps I should say, cares little for other members of his species. He does have a rat upon which he dotes. Peter Hobson's scholarly monograph, The Cradle of Thought, The Origins of Thinking, more aggressively pathologizes cognitive difference, not even bothering to posit a diminished form of empathetic concern. Hobson compares the mentalizing abilities of autistics to those of chimpanzees, deploying the trope of the mind as a home to underscore what is missing in both. I sat gazing at a chimpanzee who sat on the other side of a fence, gazing at me. I felt something missing. I could not connect. I was reminded of the experience one sometimes gets when relating to a child with autism, if one is not filling the void by saying things or doing things. It was as if the chimpanzee was not at home, mentally speaking, or at least I was not entering a home in his mind. I wondered if this was because we belonged to different species. Would it be different if I were a chimpanzee? I seriously doubt it. Hobson could not have been aware of Dawn Prince's deep connection to primates, which she would relate the year after his book appeared in her best-selling memoir of autism, Songs of a Gorilla Nation, or of her now famous encounter with Kanzi, a bonobo chimpanzee who had been taught to communicate with lexicograms and who, in a mixture of such lexicograms and American Sign Language, asked Prince if she was a gorilla. But he had to have been aware of Temple Grandin's deep connection to cattle, which Grandin had extensively discussed years before his book appeared in her best-selling memoir of autism. Hobson presumes not only the impossibility of interacting meaningfully as a human with an animal, but also the impossibility of interacting meaningfully as an animal with another animal. The effect is to construct cognitive difference as an insurmountable and lamentable problem. Traditional accounts of theory of mind do not even attempt to navigate inter- and intraspecies distinctiveness. Rather, they declare a lack by fiat having failed to find vaunted human abilities in a customary form. Nor do they appreciate, as Grandin herself does, how certain challenges become boons in another context. Whatever difficulties she may or may not have with humans, Grandin has tremendous feeling for animals. After all, she revolutionized the cattle industry by understanding how a cow experiences its own commercial slaughter. It does not occur to Hobson that many neurotypicals may have a theory of mind deficit, if we're going to speak of deficits, with respect to the animal world. Seen in this light, traditional theory of mind reveals a species bias, or privileging of human concerns. In what follows, I explore another deep connection in autism to objects, proposing that we take seriously the possibility of a much less human-centered empathy. I link this connection to the trope of personification, noting its prominence in literary writing and suggesting that we consider it a bridge not only between a child who relates to the world animistically and the adult who relates to it rationally, but also between the adult neurotypical who privileges the human and the adult autist who, research has shown, appears to privilege the non-human. It is quite possible that in lyrical writing, autistics, at least initially, misrecognize the trope of personification as reflecting a kind of attention much closer to their own. To be clear, I'm in no way positing fixed neurobiological traits in either group, but rather proclivities that are amenable to cultural modulation and translation. But first I want to briefly discuss, amidst the deluge of neuroscientific studies proclaiming the absence of empathy in autism, a number of studies that paint a more complicated picture. I do so in order to make a distinction between a categorical and a precategorical engagement with experience. Reuven Sur argues that poetry, which paradoxically blurs the boundaries that language upholds through figures of speech such as simile, metaphor, personification, and synesthesia, longs to recapture some portion of experience before it has been presented to the conscious mind in categorical terms. This is a human, that is a tree, this is a rock, etc. I link precategorical sensory input with a specific component of empathy, namely emotional empathy, which, as F.B. de Waal notes, is rooted in the phenomenon of emotional contagion and is phylogenetically much older than empathy's other aspects or parts. Emotional empathy, we might say, disrespects the limits that have come to define empathy generally as cognitive perspective taking among discrete human subjects, thus connecting us to other mammals, especially primates, but also perhaps to what the poet Richard Wilbur calls the things of this world. As a study from 2005 showed, empathy is not a unitary system, but rather, quote, a loose collection of partially dissociable systems, end quote. Comparing and contrasting psychopaths with autistics, this has actually been done. It found that psychopaths excelled at cognitive and motor empathy. The former is the ability to translate feelings into abstract propositions about the mental states of others. The latter is the ability to successfully perform an empathetic response with your body. But psychopaths lacked emotional empathy, or what Simone Chamatursi terms the capacity to experience affective reactions to the observed experiences of others, end quote. In contrast, autistics struggled with cognitive and motor empathy, but revealed little trouble with emotional empathy. This result was confirmed by a study from 2008, which found that subjects with Asperger's syndrome had difficulty with cognitive empathy, but did not, quote, differ from controls in emotional empathy, end quote. In 2009, Scottish researcher Adam Smith, not the early Adam Smith, proposed the empathy imbalance hypothesis, which holds that autistics possess, quote, a surfeit of emotional empathy, making them susceptible to empathetic over-arousal, end quote. Such over-arousal has the effect of exacerbating difficulties with cognitive and motor empathy and of making the autist appear much less empathetic than he or she actually is. As I write elsewhere, describing autism as a difficulty attaching words to emotional states and motorically executing an expected response is very different from describing it as a lack of feeling for other people. The autobiographical literature is replete with accounts of autistics fusing with the pain of others. So completely do they experience it, or of needing time to organize their thoughts and bodies in the face of such an emotional onslaught. Yet even the concept of partially dissociable systems does not tell the complete story of autistic empathy. The research literature consistently refers to autistics as exhibiting a strong preference for objects over people. For example, a study from 2003 notes that with neurotypicals, quote, social stimuli are seen as having a higher degree of salience than competing in animate stimuli. That's with neurotypicals. When viewing a popular American children's TV show, a neurotypical child will focus on the characters and their actions. In contrast, an autistic child will, quote, visually inspect inanimate details on the shelves behind these characters, end quote. Neurotypical children begin to privilege human speech sounds in utero, and after they are born, they quickly learn to privilege human faces. Neither of these proclivities appears to be true in autism. As Temple Grandin writes in her most recent book, The Autistic Brain, neuroimaging studies have repeatedly indicated that the cortex of an autistic doesn't respond to faces as animatedly as it does to objects, end quote. The authors of the 2003 study that I previously referenced speculate that decreased attention to social stimuli, quote, could be the basis for a cascade of developmental events in which a child with autism fails to accrue the social experiences that are the basis for social cognitive development. So that's the pathological view, end quote. While the theory does not explicitly acknowledge the downside of ordinary attention, it does concede that with neurotypicals, the vast complexity of the surrounding environment is greatly simplified in terms of a differential topology of salience, which separates aspects that are irrelevant, for example, light fixtures, a person turned away, from those that are crucially important, someone staring at you. And just to jump ahead a little bit, one of my arguments is that a lyric poem actually corrects for typical neurotypical attention. In other words, the very notion of relevant and irrelevant stimuli is precisely what is at stake in any discussion of autistic difference. On the self-advocate website Wrong Planet, the mother of an autistic child posted a message in which she sought guidance on her son's, quote, obsessive empathy for inanimate objects, end quote. If he drops a food wrapper, he thinks the wrapper will be upset if he does not put it in the bin, she explained. If a chocolate chip falls off his biscuit, then he will put it back with its friends. Responding to this mother, a number of people with autism and Asperger's syndrome reported that they also treat objects in this manner. How to consider the implications of object-centered attention in a neutral or neurodiverse way. How to consider its implications for object-centered empathy, though to describe it as object-centered is already to impose a neurotypical way of thinking. Better to conceive of the autist, in the words of Aaron Manning, as, quote, consumed by the ecology of what is unfolding around him. This ecology, writes Manning, quote, is not an object per se, though it may appear as though an autistic child is indeed consumed by an object. It is less a thing in itself that captures his attention than it is an intensive shaping, a complex relational matrix, a milieu of light, color, movement, sound, and social context, end quote. In her YouTube sensation, In My Language, autist Amanda Baggs explicitly politicizes the denigration of this sort of attention. Ironically, the way that I move when responding to everything around me is described as, quote, being in a world of my own, end quote, whereas if I interact with a much more limited set of responses and only react to a much more limited part of my surroundings, people claim I'm opening up to true interaction with the world, end quote. We can see this complex relational matrix in the work of Dawn Prince. In her essay, My Grave and the Last Sideshow Tent, she remarks, I have always felt everything The too bright sun, the deafening loudness of whispers. I can taste sound and smell colors. I was and am permeable. And I'll talk a lot about synesthesia toward the end. This notion of permeability puts pressure on any stable sense of a discrete subject or object. Indeed, a conventional topology of salience will not accommodate what she perceives and feels. There is no doubt that I am different in some ways from other people, Prince explains. This never lets me forget that I'm part of everything. It loves me hard, and I love it hard in return. It demands my empathy. Born out of a different kind of attention and sensory processing, such empathy seems to spread across a field, refusing both ordinary containment and hierarchical expression. In another essay titled The Silence Between, Prince reveals how as a girl she wanted language to match the relational engagement of her senses. I remember learning the word hippopotamus. Hippopotamus, I would say, going by my grandparents' bedroom, and the word would become infused with the security of their sleeping, the cedar of the closed chest against the wall, my grandmother's makeup in muted colors. Hippopotamus, I would say, as I skipped past the bathroom, and the word would partake of the smells there, and the joyful sound of running water, and the warm bathing. To me, it was a completely valid response when someone asked me, "Do you need to go to the bathroom?" to answer, hippopotamus. From synesthesia comes a radically cross-modal approach to existence. Everything from ostensibly discrete objects to organisms to words is processed through its neighbors. Categories do not hold. In fact, Prince pushes the limit of linguistic understanding by infusing the word hippopotamus with a kind of private, because thoroughly metonymic meaning. Only something like poetry, with its plastic and permeable approach to language and with its own coordinated metonymies and emotional gestalt, can begin to capture this sense of relation, this milieu of light, color, movement, sound, and social context. For Prince, a fiercely animistic orientation to experience renders everything alive, so alive that it allows her to communicate with the non-human world in what she calls the language of silence. Here, too, categories dissolve as not only creatures, but also inanimate trees and streams take on a central human characteristic, namely speech. When I was young, I talked to animals in that language of silence. I knew what trees and streams were saying because they told me. I knew what sow-bugs were saying because they molded me. I grew together with them because of the words of living together in a world where everything needed everything else. Sometimes my grandfather would ask me in the garden, "What are the worms saying today?" "Fine, fine, slither dirt, push, good, rotting green," I would answer, smiling. Of course, the language of worms is a paradoxical language, one that can only be heard by neurotypical adults in poetic translation. Prince seems to need for grammar itself to fracture so that she can capture this language. Nevertheless, as in the aforementioned YouTube by Amanda Baggs, the linguistic trope remains, despite the fact that language does not seem to be central to autistic intelligence. It is as if, when addressing neurotypicals, autistics have no other way of expressing the mute, though completely vital, significance of what exists around them. Language, to put it simply, is the ultimate marker of the privilege neurotypicals grant themselves. And yet, if we know that autistics respond to objects in a more animated way than people, can we really call this gesture personification, or as anthropologists like to say, anthropomorphism? In personification, non-human entities, of course, act like persons, which is to say that the hierarchy governing neurotypical attention breaks down, extending social worthiness and agency to the non-human world. What is merely a conceit to one group, however, may be anything but to another. When I asked Prince Tito Mukhopadhyay about the trope of personification in his work, he remarked with considerable annoyance, "It shall be called panpsychism by me." There's an example you can show students of when to use the passive voice. For Mukhopadhyay, personification is too domesticated and rational a term to convey what he regularly experiences in life and then tries to capture in his work. The point is that however much it may seem a poor cousin to actual animism, personification may serve as an empathetic meeting place for different neurotypes. Indeed, in a Western context, lyric poetry and essays may be understood as deploying the figure of personification nostalgically to reanimate what typical development renders flat and less deserving of regard. With its additional figures of speech, such as simile, metaphor, and synesthesia, all of which undermine habits of rigid categorization, its repudiation of the abstract concept in favor of the sensuous detail, its explicit appeal to emotion, and even its adoption of a solitary speaker who communicates with his inanimate surroundings, such writing may be said to recreate the world as autistics know it, or at least a linguistic translation of something closer to that wider field of relation and attention. Neurotypicals may appeal to this kind of literature and to the work of autistic writers such as Prince and Mukhopadhyay. Specifically, I propose to get a sense of what a less human-centered empathy might look like. The emerging neuroscience of personification provides additional insight, both with respect to the meeting place of lyric writing and to these different forms of empathy, autistic and neurotypical, which reflect, I would argue, different proportions of empathy's component parts, the emotional and the cognitive. The former, as we shall see, aligns with precategorical perception and feeling, the latter with self-conscious categorization. Lyric writing splits the difference, and in so doing not only recalls the neurotypical child's orientation to the world, but also makes room for the autistic adults. Yet what does contemporary neuroscience tell us about personification? When neurotypical adults personify or anthropomorphize, do they really think of objects as people? A study titled The Brooms in Fantasia, that's the slide, found that anthropomorphism does not appear to activate the medial prefrontal cortex, a brain region considered central to social cognition. As researchers Lasana Harris and Susan Fisk note with respect to the Disney cartoon their study references, one can imagine an army of brooms without thinking about their minds as humanly complex. Deploying the insights of their previous neuroimaging work on the perception of extreme outgroups such as homeless people and drug addicts, Harris and Fisk hypothesized that objects, unlike people in extreme outgroups, do not profit from the individuation that familiarity occasions. Whereas simply wondering what a particular homeless person had for lunch can bring the MPFC online, an object, despite its apparent humanization and anthropomorphism, remains resolutely non-human. It remains, that is, like members of an extreme outgroup who have been conceived in strictly categorical terms. Let me give you another slide. Brooms in general sweep, and even a single evil animated broom rapidly morphs into an army of like-minded brooms, Harris and Fisk explain. Although the researchers established the link between objects and extreme outgroups merely to illuminate an effect of categorical thinking and do not themselves pursue the implications of their provocative analogy, I would suggest that it may tell us something about how neurotypicals actually regard objects, despite sometimes dressing them in anthropomorphic garb. Personification, to put it bluntly, may resemble unspoken, even unrecognized prejudice. I said I would do something wild and speculative. I should say that objects do profit from the individuation that familiarity occasions in one important respect. Amygdala response decreases. The amygdala is involved in fear conditioning and has been shown to be more active when people perceive individuals through categories such as race. Harris and Fisk surmise that, quote, specific objects to which we make dispositional attributions tend not to be emotionally arousing because they are so familiar. But when a familiar object, such as a pen or a broom, suddenly becomes a quote, an army of like-minded objects, as in Fantasia, amygdala activation increases and customary anthropomorphism morphs into something unsettling, end quote. In this respect, categorical thinking seems to be associated with both dehumanization and fear. I should also say that other researchers believe that the medial prefrontal cortex might be activated in personification. In their 2007 study, Daniel Smilek et al. Write, quote, although there are very few neuroimaging studies of personification, the available evidence implicates a personification network that includes 5 critical areas, including the medial frontal cortex. Smilek and his colleagues did not consider the Harrison Fisk study as it appeared the year after their study was published. Let me just get a sip of water. Stephen Farmer has argued that anthropomorphism is simply a side effect of normal brain development, a, quote, natural extension of the systems of the social brain to the inanimate world, end quote. The human drive to be social, which cannot be resisted on the level of basic cognitive processing, spills out onto the non-human one. One aspect of this drive concerns the way that we monitor movement. As Harrison and Fisk put it, people effortlessly attribute human states to non-human objects engaged in non-random action. We do so in order to, quote, assign a stable trait that guides behavior, end quote. And yet for the person perception network to be fully activated, the medial frontal prefrontal cortex must be involved. The neurotypical brain, according to Fisk and Harris, apparently keeps track not only of what is human, but also, because it has been shaped by culture, of what kind of human it is seeing. While this would have to be specifically tested, autistic brains, for a variety of reasons, do not appear to operate like this, or at least to the degree or at the speed that neurotypical brains do. These reasons include, but are not limited to, any atypical topology of salience, a penchant for seeing details instead of wholes, a surfeit of emotional empathy, and synesthesia, as we will see. Each of these things retards the process of easy categorization and invites generative confusion. What Melba Cuddy-Keene in another context calls, quote, a positive hiatus of consciousness which clears the space for unmediated sensory response. In retarding the process of easy categorization, each of these things thus prolongs the feeling or precategorical stage of empathy, emotional empathy. When Dawn Prince used to skip past the bathroom and the word hippopotamus would partake of the smells there and the joyful sound of running water and the warm bathing, she disrespected the categories that underpin conventional language and instead condensed a dynamic field of relation. She adopted, that is, a linguistic equivalent for something like sensory-driven emotional empathy, which, as I've pointed out, is often referred to because it spreads as contagion. As a child, Prince had to learn that for most people, language was a kind of weapon rather than an amorphous mist of the birth waters of reality. It cut up the world, and its use also cut groups of people, one from another. I heard people using language to shout division, Prince recalls. I heard from my family the unmistakably violent brackets of racial epithets and the kind of simple dichotomies of speech that boiled down to us and them, white, black, fat, thin, Christian, heathen, the living and the dead. What Prince discovered, we might say, is how the person perception network typically functions, or may typically function. It distinguishes the human world from the natural one, and some humans from others, by means of categories that reflect a certain level of neurocultural salience. The lower the salience, the less of a subject a given entity is considered to be. Later, when working on a PhD in anthropology, Prince was forced to learn this lesson again, and in a particularly painful manner. In those days, I was writing about primates, she explains, and I realized that their way of speaking, the language that I listened to and took for granted, once again whole, might as well have been a stone in the bottom of a pond to the other academics I talked to. When Kanzi attempted to use language to ask if she was a gorilla, Prince had just finished playing with Kanzi in a manner she had copied from the gorillas she knew. Kanzi had previously watched a video of a gorilla named Coco who had been taught American Sign Language, or some American Sign Language. Prince realized that she could not write about the experience, quote, within the rules. I couldn't build on other people's ideas, she laments. I couldn't cite previous research. I couldn't capture what had happened in terse and distant language. Even the subject itself was taboo as anthropomorphism. The translation of the purportedly less than human into the human is at best naive, claim the experts, and at worst self-absorbed, though in this context such a charge would have to be considered extraordinarily ironic. It would also reflect a kind of conceptual impoverishment. As Brian Masumi argues, no general ideas about humans and animals and interspecies relations are adequate to grasp the richness and inventiveness of what transpired between Kanzi and Prince. If we ignore the non-human valence of Prince's approach and persist in placing the human at the forefront as the motivating force of all events, her words will seem anthropomorphic, stresses Manning. This is not the case of, quote, a human once more telling the story of an animal in human terms, she says. The key here, as I will try to show, is the link between personification and the precategorical. Prince connects, we might say, on the level of the precategorical, and she preserves such feelings in her conscious response. Elsewhere, I refer to this moment of species confusion as an especially provocative example of neurocosmopolitanism, a term I've coined to capture the dynamic, hybridizing interaction of different neurological organisms, from animals to humans, both neurotypical and autistic. Misrecognizing a human for a gorilla, or vice versa, Prince conspicuously refers to Kanzi as a captive-born man, is akin to saying hippopotamus when you have to go to the bathroom. Such a truly relational engagement with difference not only mocks categorical division, but it also reveals a host of transformative possibilities for each of the parties involved. In a chapter titled Autism, a Fancy Word, from his memoir, How Can I Talk If My Lips Don't Move? Great book. Tito Mukhopadhyay provides his own example of the violence of categorical thinking. Like Prince, he too responds with the antidote of literary personification, contriving a way to express precategorical intimations of an indivisible unity. A mischievous send-up of the moment of diagnosis, what might be called the primal scene of autism, the chapter nicely reminds us of the motion detection aspect of the person-perception network. For Mukhopadhyay, however, that motion is sufficient to grant something like full personhood. Indeed, it is the basis of an inclusive animistic community. Listen to him recount the process of diagnostic reasoning that produces autistic pathology. I remember the clinical psychologist writing down, or rather hearing her write down, something in her chart, which later I was told by Mother when she and I could converse was the word non-response. And because I flapped my hands, because I did not respond to those building blocks, because I did not talk, and because I could not imitate her, the diagnosis, autism. Of course, Mukhopadhyay is responsive to other elements in the environment. He is just not responsive to what the clinical psychologist has deemed relevant. Clearly imitating her in another way, Mukhopadhyay then engages in such diagnostic reasoning himself. Now that I knew I was autistic, I began to group things under it. I made up a whole list of things that I thought had autism. The curtains that moved in the wind, the big and small leaves that moved a little more with the air because of their suspended positions, the little bits of paper or the pages of an open book under a fan were classified as autistic. They were affected with autism because they flapped their arms, because they would not play with building blocks, because they did not talk, and I was sure that they would not be able to imitate the clinical psychologist. Saving his most biting irony for the end, Mukhopadhyay wonders how the clinical psychologist would look if she imitated the leaves on a branch, if the leaves wanted to find out about her condition. Neurotypicality, he suggests, is its own pathology, whose primary symptom is precisely its severely circumscribed and value-laden topology of salience. I wish to tell the curtains and the leaves that they too are autistic, Mukhopadhyay writes, at once satirizing the doctor and affirming his bond with what Manning calls the more than human. Mukhopadhyay and Prince both offer narratives of autistic children who must learn to negotiate a neurotypical world, but part of that negotiation involves the more general project of acquiring an adult perspective. After all, Jean Piaget understood the typical child's animistic tendencies, which go significantly beyond modest linguistic anthropomorphism, as a stage of development that the child must pass through. Piaget called this period of animistic connection the pre-operational stage, and he considered it to be egocentric, as the child imagines that the world and he are one because the world is exactly like him. We need not agree with Piaget's characterization, if only because claiming that a child cannot adopt the point of view of another person already reflects a preference for a certain kind of subject, a discrete one, and a certain kind of attention, human-centered. Contemporary accounts of child development stress the emergence of critical faculties in the child's brain, such as the ability to categorize ever more abstractly, along with clear cultural predilections about how the non-human world should be conceived, that curb, quote, the social biases of perception, which are present at birth and which give rise to animism and anthropomorphism. Such changes in the child's brain affect not only the process of motor detection, but also of motor simulation, which is increasingly thought to underlie empathy. According to this theory, mirror neurons, quote, enable direct bodily access to the actions, emotions, and sensations of others, end quote. When the child is very young, his experience is, quote, almost exclusively mediated by a simulative perception of events, end quote. Awash in feeling, the child literally copies the movements that he sees. With the development of the mirror mechanism, argue Vittorio Galisi and Hanna Wojciechowski, quote, the child learns to refrain from acting out the automatic matching mechanism linking action perception and execution. Such development can be viewed as a transition from mandatory reenactment to a covert simulation of the observed motor acts, most likely through the maturation of prefrontal inhibiting mechanisms, end quote. What begins as a necessarily indiscriminate and overt mirroring of the world, without categories, no humans, no non-human, effectively linking the young child with everything that he or she observes, evolves into a much more covert and judicious process. For David Mial, the covert nature of embodied simulation in adulthood ensures that, quote, animistic intuition takes hold in our thinking before we are aware of it. In other words, it does not go away once the child is grown. Rather, it continues to serve as the feeling framework for our initial primitive response to an object, quote, prior to the processing that issues in a recognizable image with cognitive meaning. Citing the work of Ralph Ellis, Mial notes, quote, emotional and action-initiating processes are triggered as early as 18 to 20 milliseconds prior to any occipital processing, prior to what your eyes do, prior to what your eye, the process of recognizing what it is you're seeing. The mirror neuron system invokes capacities at the precategorical, pre-reflective level, Mial emphasizes. I take him to be saying that emotionally registered motion gives us the subconscious feeling of animism long before we have the opportunity to think or not to think about the minds of objects as humanly complex. Mial even goes so far as to note the system's, quote, ambivalence over agency, over what acts in us and who it is that acts, end quote. Indeed, for a few hundred milliseconds, mirror neurons allow something, quote, to be understood independently of agency, end quote. This confusion of subject and object, self and world, is quickly vanquished by neurotypicals with meaning born from categorical analysis, vanquished without our really knowing it. For Mial, poetry is a place where it can be consciously pursued and at least partially recovered. Said another way, poetry constitutes the uneasy reconciliation of the two phases of our response. It is no coincidence that for Mial, the poet par excellence of such a recovery mission is William Wordsworth, who, like Mukhopadhyay, believed in something similar to panpsychism, and who in his early poems also attributed a mind to all things. But is there medial prefrontal cortex activation when readers confront personification in poems? We don't know. It has not been specifically tested. The linguistic examples of personification in the Harrison Fisk study, for example, the broom sat on the windowsill, were fairly modest and were not at all fortified by the other elements of poetry. Assuming, though, that Mial is correct, we must nevertheless acknowledge the strange way in which neurotypical readers can move with ease from the carefully defined arena of poetry, where immodest personification seems perfectly natural, to the much less defined arena of life, where it does not. Autistics, I'm proposing, behave like immodestly personifying poets all of the time. They seem to forestall the restrictive overlay of cognitive response, dwelling a bit longer in the space of precategorical sensation. Listen to Mukhopadhyay as he describes the simple process of, quote, water filling up a red bucket. I first noticed the color of the bucket. I might easily get distracted by its redness, since it would remind me of how my hands bled when I had fallen from a swing, how I was so absorbed in that red that I had forgotten about my pain, and how that red resembled a hibiscus. I would then realize that I was hearing the sound of water, wondering why that sound reminded me of a drowning man's last blood flow, although I'd never seen a drowning man in real life, let alone the flow of his blood. The bucket is filled up eventually, and I see water spilling from it. I understand the situation, waking from my branching thoughts, summoning up the components into one conclusion, which is water filling a red bucket from a garden tap. And if an environment is new to him, he's got to build the environment each and every time. If it's familiar, he can jump to the categorical. That's a door, that's a window, that's a table. As I say, Mukhopadhyay must build the world bit by bit. He does not receive it automatically. Here, Cuddy Keen's positive hiatus of consciousness is less a suspension of thought than a deferral of categorical certainty. Mukhopadhyay links unrelated moments and objects precisely because he cannot help but follow the branching associations of affective sensation. Like the water itself, his thoughts spill, and yet he has learned to express his spilling thoughts in an artful way. Indeed, he's become an exemplary literary neurocosmopolite. Offering an informative, insider account of autism, he uses language in a manner that delights in delaying, if not subverting, altogether the one conclusion. A final passage from Mukhopadhyay's memoir allows us to see what bearing this different kind of perception has on empathy. In it, nearly everything I've discussed comes together, from the force of emotional contagion to the utterly relational and animistic sense of attunement to the blurring of categorical distinctions. In the passage, Mukhopadhyay is listening to a news report about a coal mining disaster. I see these stories sometimes in vermilion or indigo, the richness depending upon the intensity of the stories. Sometimes they smell like vitriol, and sometimes they smell like boiling starch in a pot of clay. And sometimes they have the essence of the twilight sky. As I feel my worries for the trapped coal miners, I can smell the boiling starch, frothing on the brim of the clay pot, then spilling out with the smell of burning rice. My worries grow as the voice of the newsreader continues to say that the miners are still trapped. I smell burning rice spread across the room as more starch spills out. My body begins to itch as though tiny black tickle ants have been set free from a box. They can smell the burning rice from the spilling starch, and they rush around to find the source with a collective ant hunger. My worry now accumulates in and across my itching skin as the voice of the newsreader comes from far away, like a blue floating balloon. I have no hold on it because it floats away, leaving me with itchy skin. Mukhopadhyay makes clear just how tragically misguided is the oft-repeated claim of an empathy deficit in autism, though part of the genius of the passage lies precisely in the way that it narrates the debilitating effect of so much feeling. From the outside, a sensory and emotional meltdown does not look like empathy, because neurotypicals tend to privilege its cognitive, which is to say contained and productive expression. Of course, the passage relates this breakdown with extraordinary skill. Through the form of the lyric essay or prose poem, Mukhopadhyay is able, belatedly, to restore a cognitive dimension to his feeling without sacrificing that feeling's intensity or sensory dimension. Notice the extent to which he needs metaphors: the boiling starch, the twilight sky, the tickle ants, the blue floating balloon, to depict his surfeit of emotional empathy. To craft objective correlatives, in Eliot's phrase, for the failure of cognition is no small challenge. This kind of linguistic expression requires both imagination and invention. Words must bend, categories must blur, as in the figure of speech we call synesthesia. But more needs to be said about the actual phenomenon of synesthesia itself, which turns out to be quite common in autism, and in Mukhopadhyay's case has been verified by neuroimaging, and which, interestingly enough, has been linked to especially vigorous personification in non-autistics. For example, a study from 2007, I mentioned it earlier, focused on a woman, quote, for whom inanimate objects are experienced as having rich and detailed personalities, end quote, and for whom letters and numbers are experienced as, quote, highly consistent and specific sensory experiences of color, a condition referred to as Graphemecolor synesthesia. By the way, in an unpublished essay, Tito, by the way, speaks of, quote, being covered by cobwebs linking a sound with a smell, a color with a number. You recall, he says, how the yellow of the sunflower's petals linked uncompromisingly with the number 11 in a sticky, cobwebby hold. You were the clumsy fly trapped between the why and the why not of a yellowing world. So this is an example of that ordinal synesthesia. As Smilik and his colleagues note, synesthesia can involve complex semantic personification which can actually influence visual attention. Their subjects personifying propensities, and again, she was not autistic, were so vigorous as to be, quote, indiscriminately activated by almost every object. Previous research had documented a more modest version of the phenomenon called ordinal linguistic personification, in which individuals, quote, attribute animate-like qualities such as personality and gender to sequential linguistic units, letters, numerals, days, months. Graphemecolor synesthesia and ordinal linguistic personification tend to co-occur and share characteristics with other variants of synesthesia. The authors of the 2007 study speak of a personification network strongly activated by objects that for normal individuals either do not activate or weakly activate this network. So it would be great to get poets in scanners to see whether they start off this way or whether a lifetime of animating objects on the page might make you something like this. We don't know, but anyway. So weakly activate this network, and they propose that object personality pairings are, quote, likely due to a greater number of neural connections in the network or reduced inhibition of normally occurring connections, end quote. Such connections probably take place in the parietal and frontal regions in areas associated with personification of the self and with shifts of covert and overt attention. Parietal regions, they note, have been associated with disengaging attention from objects. While the authors believe that the subject's object-personality pairing simply constitute an extreme version of anthropomorphic inclinations in non-synesthetes, other researchers suggest that such pairings typically disappear through a process of neural pruning as a child develops. So it may be that most children, when they're very, very young, do this kind of extreme personification. And experience, if you spend a lot of time with kids, suggests that really might be true. As I mentioned earlier, debate persists about whether or not the medial prefrontal cortex is activated in personification. Perhaps in the phenomenon's most extreme form, it is. We do not know if this model can account for extraordinary personification in autism. In emphasizing the concept of neurological difference, progressive scientific research on autism has been drawn to the role of the sensory in autistic thought. For instance, a meta-analysis by Fabian Sampson et al. Confirmed that when performing high-level cognitive tasks, autistics evince comparatively more activity in the temporal, occipital, and parietal regions and less activity in the frontal cortex than non-autistics. A stronger engagement of sensory processing mechanisms may facilitate an atypically prominent role for perceptual mechanisms in supporting cognition. So there's a study from 2006 comparing autistics, non-autistics with high image sentences, low image sentences. High image sentence would be the number 8 rotated 90 degrees, looks like a pair of glasses. And autistics look much more like neurotypicals in that setting because we all recruit our occipital lobes and parietal lobes along with our traditional language centers. When it's a low image sentence, 18 minus 11 equals 7, neurotypicals use their traditional language centers. Autistics continue to recruit the same region. So it's an argument about arriving at the same endpoint using different parts of the brain. I'm being more generous in my interpretation of the scientists' conclusions. Laurent Motron's model of enhanced perceptual functioning in autism nicely dovetails with how Stephen Farmer has theorized anthropomorphism. Farmer underscores, quote, the maintenance throughout development of topographic symmetry in brain maps as higher level cognition is shaped by the biases of lower level systems. This is what he means by the natural extension of the systems of the social brain to the inanimate world. In other words, underneath your thinking is the force, this over-determining force that governs your attention. That would be the argument, that those perceptual states not available to consciousness except for synesthetes, it would be. Synesthetes, he contends, retain, quote, a heightened awareness of these lower-level perceptual maps, which is perhaps another way of saying that they retain a sense of the precategorical as it applies to the social, before we learn to make value-laden distinctions. In Motron's model, autistics disproportionately use these lower-level perceptual maps to think. And my hunch is that poets do the same. Again, it would have to be tested. But I think poets learn, what is meter, all the sound stuff, that I think they're thinking on the level of the perceptual more than they would, let's say, outside the writing or the reading of a poem. When I explicitly asked Mukhopadhyay about empathy in the passage concerning the trapped miners, he personified both an object in the miner's relational field and the very medium that supports living creatures in that field, namely oxygen. It's true that when I think of the situation, there may be empathy, but my empathy would probably be towards the flashlight batteries of those trapped coal miners, if there happens to be a selection on my part. Or my empathy would be towards the trapped air around those coal miners. There would be me watching through the eyes of the flashlight cell the utter hopelessness of those unfortunate miners as my last chemical struggled to glow the faint bulb so that I didn't leave them dying in darkness. As the air around them, I would try to find a way to let myself squeeze every bit of oxygen I have to allow the doomed lungs to breathe, for I'm responsible for their doom. And while I found myself trapped, I would smell the burning rice being cooked with neglect in an earthen pot. This young man can write. Importantly, Mukhopadhyay does not feel empathy for the miners, even though in the passage from his book he expressed his growing worry for their predicament, and even though in this passage he considers himself responsible for their doom. Rather, he feels empathy toward the flashlight batteries, which provide a kind of comforting, if waning, illumination. Indeed, he feels so much empathy that he becomes the chemicals in the battery cells, and as the passage progresses, molecules of oxygen in the underground chamber. His empathetic presence, like the light itself or the air around those miners, is diffuse. There is no subject-object structure to limit or contain his feeling. By the end of the passage, he finds himself trapped. He has lost sight, or we might say feel, of the difference between listening to a news report of a mining disaster and being one of the doomed miners. This is not a cognitive apprehension, though Mukhopadhyay manages, as I've said, to belatedly give words to the experience. Rather, it is a perceptual apprehension, synesthetically conveyed by the smell of burning rice being cooked with neglect in an earthen pot. Again, as a writer, he must lean on sensory-rich figurative language to capture how he, as a sort of leaky self, that's Aaron Manning's term, experiences empathy. He has done so with flair, and in the process presented a powerful example of how literature might help us to rethink empathy in autism. Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.